Guys, so we're going to start off using fundamental identities or trig identities. So one of the questions you'll note in 501, they give you a trig function. They tell you another function is either greater than zero, which is positive, or less than zero, which means negative. And they ask you to find another trig function. So there are two methods to solving this problem. You can either use your trig identities or right triangle trig, completely up to you. So I'm going to show you the first method. We're going to try to get as much information as we can from here. So if I know that secant equals -3/2, automatically my reciprocal identity tells me since secant and cosine are reciprocals of each other, that means that cosine is equal to -2/3. Reciprocals keep the same sign. And since I'm going to find the sine value, I'm going to look under my identities again, and this tells me that I can directly correlate cosine and sine using the Pythagorean identity. So what's pretty much the point of knowing that tangent is greater than zero? Well, from here, remember your unit circle. There are two quadrants where tangent is positive, which is what greater than zero means. So positive. So those quadrants are quadrants 1 and 3. So I know that tangent is greater than 0. I'm either in quadrant 1 or 3. So out of these two quadrants, where is secant or cosine, because they share the same sign, negative? So it can't be quadrant 1 because cosine can't be negative in quadrant 1. All is positive in quadrant 1. So the quadrant where tangent is positive and cosine is negative is in quadrant 3. So why would that matter? Well, remember you're finding the sine value, and in quadrant 3, sine is also negative. So just make a note of that. That sine, whenever you get the answer, it should also be negative. I'll show you why that matters after we apply the Pythagorean identity. So applying the Pythagorean identity, mind you, sine squared x is just another way to say sine x squared, plus cosine squared just means cosine, and the whole trig function is squared equals to 1. I'm going to plug in what I know. So I don't know sine. I'm going to bring that down. I do know that cosine is -2/3 equals 1. And then when I square, keep in mind, when I square a fraction, I square both the numerator and denominator. And once I square a fraction, it also becomes positive. So this would give me 4/9 equals 1. So using your algebra, you're just going to isolate sine of x because that's what we're looking for. We're going to subtract 4/9 on both sides. Out of room on this one, so I'm going to just move it right here. Um, so I'm going to get sine, which is still squared, equals 1 minus 4/9, which is 5/9. And then from here, I'm going to get rid of the square by square rooting. Whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. So I'm left with sine equals square root of 5/9. Now, fun fact, when you square root a fraction, you can square root each one individually. So I'm going to square root 5, which is just square root of 5, and I'm going to square root 9, which gives me 3, no square root. Now, other fact is that when you square root a value, you should have positive or negative. So remember back in the beginning, we determined that the sine value was negative. So sine should be negative, not positive or negative, not both of them, just one. And there we are. So one of the ways you can use is the trig identities. The other way is to use right triangle trig. So from the same question before, we've already determined that we're in quadrant 3. So I'm going to write the same information that I figured out down here. We already know we're in quadrant 3. So I'm going to make a right triangle in quadrant 3. Now, mind you, the right triangle always sits on the x-axis. All right. And I know secant is -3/2. So I also know that cosine is -2/3. Right triangle trigonometry means SOHCAHTOA. So my cosine value is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So the adjacent side is -2, the hypotenuse is 3, which makes sense because if you look, I'm on the negative x-axis. And if you look down here, whenever I determine this length, which will be positive because the length is positive, you'll note that I'm also on the negative y-axis. So that should also be negative. So if I have 2 out of 3 sides of a right triangle, in order to find the third side, I'm going to use Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And plugging in the values that I know, I have -2 squared plus b squared equals 3 squared. And that would give me 4 plus b squared equals 9. Subtract 4 on both sides, b squared equals to 5. And again, once I get rid of the square by square rooting, b will equal to 5. Now, again, or square root of 5. Now, again, once you square root something, it should be positive or negative. But b represents a length. Length is just positive. But if you'd like, you can also make a note that you are on the negative x-axis. So you could put the negative here if you want to ahead of time, or you could just remember that you're in quadrant 3 where sine is negative. Completely your choice, but now that we have all 3 sides of the triangle, we can find any trig function that they ask for. Remember, in the question, they're asking for sine. So going back, sine is equal to opposite over hypotenuse. So sine equals the opposite side of this angle is negative square root of 5 over the hypotenuse, which is 3. And if you just use the positive length, which is square root of 5, that's fine. You already made a note that you're in quadrant 3 where sine is negative, so you can just put the negative sign down after. Two methods, but you get the same answer either way. Hope this helps.